Think about the last time you really talked to your grandmother. Not a quick text, not a 2-minute call on her birthday, not a holiday dinner where everyone was quietly checking their phones between courses. A real conversation. One where time slowed down, and she told you something you'd never heard before. Something about your family, about her life, about who you actually are and where you come from. A story that existed nowhere else in the world except in her memory. When did that last happen? For most people alive today, the honest answer is, not recently, maybe not ever. And here's what's strange about that, because for 300,000 years, for literally the entire duration of our species' existence on this planet, that kind of conversation wasn't a rare occasion. It wasn't a Sunday afternoon exception. It was Tuesday. It was every night. It was the fabric of daily life. Grandparents didn't live in separate facilities 40 minutes away. They didn't communicate through glass screens. They were there in the same space, around the same fire, weaving themselves into the daily texture of a child's world in ways we are only now beginning to measure. So what happens to a child who grows up without that? And what happens to an old person who's cut off from their grandchildren? The answers come from places you wouldn't expect. Evolutionary biology, cognitive neuroscience, and a 30-year-old anthropological theory that turned the entire field upside down. And once you hear them, you're going to look at both ends of your family tree very differently. Let's start with a question that has been quietly torturing biologists for decades. Why do women live so long after menopause? Think about what that question actually implies. In evolutionary terms, post-reproductive survival makes no obvious sense. Every other primate on the planet, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, reproduces right up until the end of their lives. The moment a female stops being able to have children, she dies within months or a few years, at most. There's no long post-reproductive chapter. Biology doesn't fund it. But human women, they stop reproducing in their late 40s or early 50s, and then they keep living for another 3 or 4 decades. Fully functional, cognitively intact, often at the height of their social and intellectual power. From a strictly Darwinian standpoint, this looks like a flaw. Why would natural selection continue to code for decades of life that produce zero offspring? Why would our genome invest resources in keeping someone alive long past the point where they can pass their genes forward? In the 1950s, evolutionary biologist George Williams flagged it as a genuine anomaly. It sat largely unanswered for 40 years. Then, in 1997, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes proposed an idea that changed everything. She called it the grandmother hypothesis. Hawkes had spent years studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania, one of the last populations on Earth still living something close to the original human way of life. No agriculture, no supermarkets, no safety nets. You eat what you find or what you hunt, every single day. And inside that population, she noticed a pattern that kept surfacing in the data, one that no one had taken seriously enough to explain. Children whose grandmothers were actively involved in their care weren't just getting by. They were thriving, they were better nourished, they were healthier, they were significantly more likely to survive past the critical early years. The grandmother wasn't sitting quietly in the background, she was working. She was out foraging for roots and tubers, foods that required the kind of knowledge and patience that only comes from decades of experience. She was processing food, carrying things, watching the younger children so the mother could nurse the infant. She was pouring her remaining productive years into children who were not her own offspring, but her grandchildren. And the mathematics of survival was brutal in its clarity. Over hundreds of thousands of years, populations with involved grandmothers outlasted populations without them. The genes that coded for longer post-reproductive female life were passed down more successfully because grandmothers were one of the single greatest survival advantages our species ever developed. Let me be precise about what that means. We did not simply tolerate old women sticking around after their reproductive window closed. We did not merely accommodate them out of sentiment or obligation. We evolved because of them. The extended human lifespan, the thing that makes us radically different from every other primate in terms of longevity, may have been selected for specifically because of what grandmother contributed. The bond between grandparent and grandchild is not decorative. It is not a cultural bonus. It is, in the most literal biological sense, one of the engines of our survival as a species. But here's what Hawkes' theory didn't fully explain. Because the grandmother hypothesis was about food, about calories, about the hard arithmetic of keeping small bodies alive in an unforgiving environment. What researchers discovered next goes somewhere far deeper than that, somewhere that has nothing to do with foraging, and everything to do with what's happening inside a child's developing brain and inside an elderly person's aging mind, in those ordinary moments when the two of them are simply together. What the science found is something that most people today have already lost, and don't even know it. In 2010, researchers at Oxford University's Center for Family Research published findings from one of the most comprehensive long-term studies ever conducted on grandparent involvement in children's lives. They tracked hundreds of families over years, measuring children's psychological and emotional development with a level of detail that previous research had rarely attempted. The results were not ambiguous. Children who had regular, meaningful contact with their grandparents showed measurably greater emotional resilience than those who didn't. They had better tools for managing stress. They recovered from setbacks faster. They were more likely to seek adult support during difficult moments rather than isolating themselves. They scored higher on measures of social competence and emotional intelligence. The researchers described it in terms of a secondary trusted adult, someone who offered unconditional love without the weight and friction of daily discipline. Think carefully about what that distinction means. A parent's job is genuinely hard. Parents say no. They enforce bedtimes. They have consequences. They carry the anxiety of responsibility for another person's entire future. That weight is real, and children feel it, which means that even in the most loving parent-child relationships, there's an underlying layer of evaluation, of expectation, of stakes. A grandparent relationship is structurally different. It's softer. There's no performance requirement. When a grandfather sits down with a child and just listens, really listens, with no agenda, no phone, no competing distraction, the child registers something at a level below conscious thought. This person loves me for exactly who I am, not for who I'm becoming or what I'm supposed to achieve. Child psychologists call this unconditional positive regard. And study after study has confirmed what common sense suggests. Children who experience it consistently develop stronger emotional foundations, more stable self-worth, and better social functioning well into adulthood. But that's only one half of the equation, because while one line of research was documenting what grandparents give to children, a completely separate line of inquiry was asking the opposite question. What does being a grandparent do to you? The American Psychological Association analyzed data from a long-term study of aging adults and found something that genuinely surprised the researchers involved. Grandparents, who maintained active, regular involvement in their grandchildren's lives, not full-time care which carries its own distinct stressors, but consistent, meaningful engagement, scored significantly higher on tests of memory and verbal fluency than grandparents who had minimal contact. Memory, verbal fluency, two of the cognitive functions that decline the earliest and the most devastatingly as the brain ages. Two of the things that we spend billions of dollars trying to protect with supplements and brain training apps and structured exercise routines, and an involved grandparent was outperforming less connected peers on both of them. Why? Think about what being an engaged grandparent actually demands of a brain. Keeping track of a child's evolving world, their school, their friendships, their fears, their jokes, their obsessions this month versus last month. Remembering specific stories and personal details across years and dozens of conversations. Translating complex adult experience into language a 7-year-old can actually absorb. Answering questions like, why is the sky blue? And did people have nightmares in ancient times? And what were you scared of when you were my age? Questions that require you to genuinely search your own memory and experience, not just retrieve cached facts. Your brain at 70 does not want to be idle. It is not designed for stillness and routine and the quiet repetition of small days. It was built for engagement, for novelty, for the specific kind of problem solving that comes from navigating relationships. And nothing delivers that quite like a child who wants to understand the world and has decided that you are the person to ask. And then there is the question of longevity itself. Harvard Medical School, along with research teams at multiple institutions, has published data showing that elderly people who maintain close, regular relationships with their grandchildren report substantially higher levels of life purpose and meaning than those who are socially isolated. They have lower rates of depression, better mental health outcomes across the board, and in multiple long-term studies tracking mortality, a measurably longer life expectancy. This is not soft data. Purpose is a biological signal. When your nervous system registers that you genuinely matter, that specific people in the world would be meaningfully worse off without you, not abstractly, but concretely and daily. It responds at a physiological level. Immune function improves. Chronic inflammation decreases. The stress hormone profile shifts towards something more stable and sustainable. An involved grandparent is not just emotionally fulfilled. They are physiologically different from an isolated one. So when did this break down? When did we decide as a civilization that grandparents belong somewhere separate? The answer is more recent than you think, and the process was quieter than any dramatic revolution. It started with industrialization. Before the 20th century, in most cultures across the world, families lived multi-generationally as a default, not out of sentiment, but because it worked. 3 or 4 generations under one roof, or close enough to walk between. Grandparents contributed. Children were embedded in a living archive of family knowledge, family story, family identity that extended backward through time in ways they could actually see and touch and hear. Then came the factory, and the office, and the city. Young people moved away from villages into urban centers. Geographic mobility became a marker of ambition and success. Families stretched across distances that a century earlier would have been unimaginable and largely permanent. Then came the retirement home. The 20th century invented, on an industrial scale, the practice of institutionalizing the elderly. It was framed as care, as progress, as giving older people a community of peers and access to medical support. And some of it genuinely was those things. But it carried a side effect that no one announced clearly. When you place grandparents in a facility across town and visit them on Christmas and on birthdays, you remove them from the daily fabric of the family. You don't sever the love, but you sever the function. The child loses their secondary trusted adult, their daily storyteller, their living connection to a history that extends beyond their parents' knowledge or memory. The grandparent loses their purpose, their cognitive engagement, their biological signal that they are still necessary to the world. And then came the screen. The video call that replaced the Sunday visit, the text message that replaced the long phone conversation, The social media post that made it feel like you were staying in touch when, in every meaningful biological sense, you weren't. Here's a detail worth sitting with. In the United States alone, over 10 million grandparents currently live in the same household as their grandchildren. The majority of them are from immigrant families, Latino, Asian, South Asian, who brought multi-generational living with them as a cultural default rather than a sacrifice. And study after study shows that children in those households consistently outperform demographically similar peers in emotional regulation, academic engagement, and long-term resilience. The data is not hidden. We simply stopped asking the question. Here's where it all comes together. That feeling you get when you're talking to an older person who actually knows you, not your social media profile, not your career trajectory, but you, the version of you that existed before you constructed the version you present to the world, that feeling is not nostalgia. It is not sentiment. It is your nervous system recognizing something ancient, something it was built to receive and has not been receiving. For 300,000 years, a child grew up inside a web of intergenerational connection. They had parents who set limits and enforced structure. They had younger siblings who needed protection. They had grandparents who offered something that no one else in the social structure could provide: continuity, the sense that this family, this bloodline, this story was going somewhere, that the child was not the beginning, that there was depth behind them and that depth had a voice, and the voice spoke directly to them. That is not a luxury. That is developmental infrastructure, and we have been systematically defunding it for 100 years. On the other side of the relationship, an older person spent their final decades embedded in the same web, needed, consulted, watched, loved not for what they could still produce economically, but for what they carried: the stories, the memory, the embodied knowledge of how to live through things. Their presence in the family was not a favor, it was architecture. Researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital have found that elderly people who report a strong sense of purpose live, on average, years longer than those who don't. Not months, years. And the single most consistent source of that purpose, across cultures, across income levels, across every demographic variable researchers have tested, is close, active family connection. Not a gym membership, not a retirement hobby, not a carefully curated social calendar. Family. Specifically, the grandparent-grandchild bond. Two people at opposite ends of a life, each giving the other precisely what they cannot get anywhere else. The child receives unconditional love and a living sense of history. The grandparent receives purpose, cognitive engagement, and the biological certainty that they are still woven into something that matters. We have spent the last century engineering that bond out of daily existence. We built retirement communities and boarding schools and nuclear family apartments. We scheduled visits and sent cards and eventually substituted screens for presents. We called it modernity. And now we have a loneliness epidemic at both ends of the age spectrum simultaneously. Children reporting anxiety and emotional dysregulation at rates that are genuinely unprecedented in the psychological literature, and elderly people dying in institutions surrounded by medical equipment and strangers, their minds deteriorating years before their bodies finally give out. Two crises. One cause. Your grandmother's stories are not just stories. They are cognitive medicine for her mind and for yours. Your grandfather's face across the table at dinner is not just comfort. It is, according to a growing body of evidence compiled across decades of research, one of the most potent developmental and longevity interventions that science has ever documented. We built a world that made it inconvenient. We built a world where the distance between grandparent and grandchild could be measured in flight hours and time zones and the particular kind of busy that everyone is, all the time, without quite knowing why. We didn't just lose Sunday dinners. We didn't just lose family traditions and shared stories and the particular smell of someone's house. We dismantled a biological structure that took 300,000 years to construct, the one that made us human in the first place. And we replaced it with the quiet hum of a video call that nobody quite knows how to end. And most of us never knew it was there, because no one ever told us what we were giving up. Until now. If something in this video landed differently than you expected, if it changed something about the way you're thinking about your family or aging, or what you might still have time to do, then subscribe, because this is what the channel is for. Not trivia, not content. Frameworks for seeing the world more clearly, starting with the parts of it that are already inside your own life. The next video is already waiting. See you there.